Welcome to Granny's Justice, a place where secrets are spoken and silence finally ends.
The night my silence was broken wasn't the night death visited my house. It was the night betrayal wore a face and I trusted. I screamed, I begged, but they mocked me, laughed at my pain, and when I finally spoke the truth, no one believed me. They called me a liar. They called me nothing. My name is Evelyn Grace Holloway.
74 years old, born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina. For decades I lived with pride, love, and sacrifice. But after my husband's death, I was stripped of everything: my dignity, my home, even my voice. But silence doesn't die. Silence sharpens. It waits, and when it finally erupts, it burns everything in its path. So listen closely, because my silence became fire. And that fire turned into revenge that shook the world. Before betrayal, there was love. And before the fire, there was a home. My husband, Thomas Holloway, was a man of stone and kindness. For 50 years, he stood by me. He built the Holloway house with his hands, brick by brick, planting magnolias outside because he knew I loved their bloom. Together, we raised two daughters, Clara and Rose. To outsiders, we were a picture-perfect Southern family. Sunday church, family dinners, holiday laughter echoing in the halls. But behind closed doors, cracks had already begun to form, tiny, silent cracks no one wanted to see. It began with whispers. Rose's husband, Daniel, entered our family like a polished coin, shiny on the outside, but rotten underneath. At first, he was charming. To charming, he smiled to wide. Touched to freely, spoke to smoothly. I ignored it. Mothers are trained to ignore, but the eyes see what the heart denies. One evening, I found him standing too close to me in the kitchen, his hand brushing against mine longer than it should have. My breath caught, but I said nothing. He laughed as if it meant nothing. That was the first time I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. After Thomas died, the house felt colder. Not because of the weather. Charleston summers are heavy and hot, but because the laughter that once filled those walls had gone silent. Daniel's presence grew heavier too. Without Thomas, he moved through the Holloway house like he owned it. He made decisions about dinners, finances, even repairs, as if my voice no longer mattered. Rose, my younger daughter, adored him blindly. His words were law to her. Clara stayed quiet, always watching, her lips pressed thin. And me, I became a ghost in my own home. It started small touches that lingered too long. Words that dripped with hidden meaning. One evening, as I lit candles in the parlor, Daniel came up behind me. Too close, his breath brushed my ear. "Evelyn," he whispered, "you're stronger than any woman I've ever met." My hands trembled. The matchstick nearly burned my skin. I stepped away and forced a smile. "Save your words for your wife, Daniel." He only grinned, that grin polished on the surface, rotten underneath, settled like a stone in my stomach. I tried to tell Rose, one night, when the whispers had become too heavy to bear. I sat her down in the kitchen. "Rose, your husband, he crosses lines. He speaks to me in ways a son should never speak to a mother." Her face went hard as flint. "Mother, you're imagining things. Daniel loves this family. Don't poison it with your bitterness." Bitterness, that's how she labeled my truth. After that, everything changed. Rose grew colder, Clara retreated further into silence, and Daniel grew bolder. At dinner he would stare across the table, his gaze never leaving me. At church he stood too close during greetings. In my own home I felt like a prisoner. When I tried to tell neighbors, they gave polite smiles and then stopped coming. Doors that used to open for me closed without a knock. It's a strange kind of hell. Being alive and invisible at the same time. If you're listening now, if you've ever felt unseen, type your city and country in the comments. Let the world know you exist. People will tell you silence is safety. I learned something different. Silence is the weapon they use to erase us. Nights in the Holloway house no longer felt like nights. They became stages for shadows, the creak of the wooden floor, the whisper of doors opening, the breath that wasn't mine, all turned into companions I never asked for. Daniel's presence was everywhere, his boots on the stairs, his silhouette in the hallway, the scent of his cologne lingering where it shouldn't, and Rose. She only saw what she wanted to see, a perfect husband, a man who could do no wrong. One night, I woke to find him standing at the foot of my bed. His smile was wrong, stretched wide, his eyes darker than the night itself. "Evelyn," he whispered, "you can scream all you want. No one will believe you. Not your daughters, not the neighbors, not the church. You're just an old woman with too much imagination." I clutched my blanket, my heart hammering. He left, but his words stayed behind, louder than any scream I could have given. I tried again, this time with Clara. She was quieter, more observant. If Rose was blind, I thought Clara might see. "Clara," I whispered one evening, "something is wrong in this house. Daniel is not the man you think he is." Her eyes softened for a moment, but fear sealed her lips. She shook her head. "Mother, please don't drag me into this. I can't." Her silence was betrayal too, but not born of malice. Fear is a chain stronger than steel. At church, I confided in Pastor Mitchell. His eyes darted nervously as I spoke. "Mrs. Holloway." He murmured, "Daniel is a respected man. These are dangerous accusations. Best not to stir waters that could drown you." Respected. Dangerous. Words that built my cage. By the end of that Sunday, whispers trailed me like shadows. I was no longer Evelyn Grace Holloway, the matriarch. I had become the crazy widow, the bitter old woman. Do you know what it feels like to be erased while still breathing? To scream and find only silence answering you. If you do, write your city and your country in the comments. Let the world see we are not as few as they think. And don't forget to like, share and subscribe, because truth multiplies only when it's heard. It was meant to be a night of remembrance. Thomas's death anniversary. I cooked his favorite meal, roasted chicken with rosemary, sweet potatoes glazed with honey, and peach cobbler for dessert. The table held the silverware Thomas had polished 100 times. Candles flickered. For a moment the house almost felt alive again. Daniel turned it into a stage. Halfway through dinner his voice cut through the clink of cutlery. "Funny, isn't it? This house, this food, all of it built by Thomas. And now is mine to keep." Rose laughed and laid her hand over his. Clara stared at her plate. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. Then he raised his glass. To Thomas, he said smoothly. Then his eyes locked on mine. "And to Evelyn, who should be grateful she still has a roof over her." "Ed, some widows aren't so lucky." Laughter followed. Neighbors chuckled. Pity and mockery rolled over me like a tide. I wanted to stand and call him a wolf, to tell them what he was. But the words stuck in my throat. That night I wasn't only invisible, I was the spectacle. Later, as the guests left, I heard what I was never meant to hear. Rose's voice. "She's losing it. Daniel, Mother is becoming a burden." Daniel's reply, smooth as poison. "Then let me handle her. Soon she'll be out of this house for good." My own daughter, whom I had held and sung to, was plotting with him to erase me. That was the night I learned a hard truth. Blood does not always mean loyalty. I locked my door that night and pressed my back to it as if my own flesh might try to break in. My diary lay open on the desk, pages full of shaking handwriting. "They will not erase me," I wrote. "I am not done. If they think I will fade quietly, they are wrong. My silence will be the fire that burns them all." Evelyn Grace Holloway died that night, the woman who took her place at their table, who softened under a lifetime of compromise. In her place, something else woke up. A quiet, sharpened thing that would not be soothed by apologies or swallowed by pity if you've ever been betrayed by your own blood. If your home has ever turned into a cage, type your city and country in the comments. Don't just share this story, like it, subscribe. Silence protects no one. When it breaks, the world trembles. The night after the dinner, I locked myself in my room. But the silence there was louder than any storm. I walked the Holloway house at midnight, each room heavy with ghosts. Thomas's chair sat by the fireplace, his pipe untouched. Outside, the magnolias swayed in the moonlight. Petals drifted down like white ash. In my own house, I felt like a stranger. 74 years of love, sacrifice, and sleepless nights had gone into these walls. Now they wanted me erased, forgotten like an old photograph. That night I wept not as a widow, not as a mother, but as a woman the world was trying to silence. On my desk lay the diary. What had once been a private place for secrets became something else, a ledger, a witness. I began to write everything, every whispered line from Daniel, every time his hand lingered, every cruel laugh at the table. Ink became my witness, paper became my ally. I knew nobody would believe me at first, but I also knew one day these pages would. A week later, he crossed the line that made everything real. I was folding laundry in the back room when Daniel came in without knocking and leaned against the doorframe, smiling like a blade. "You should start packing. Evelyn," he said, "this house doesn't need ghosts. Rose and I have talked time for you to move on. Move on." The words landed colder than any grave. That night I did not cry. I sat by candlelight with the diary open and the pen biting at the page. I wrote with a hand that did not shake from sorrow, but from a fierce clarity. They will erase me if I let them. I will not let them. My silence is no longer a prison, it is a weapon. My revenge will not only destroy Daniel. It will wake the world that laughed when I wept. In that moment, the Evelyn who had softened with years and compromise died. In her place, something hard and clear woke, quiet, relentless, unstoppable. If you have stayed with me through this chapter, hear this: silence can bury you only if you let it. I chose to rise. Type your name, city, and country in the comments. Let the world see that voices like ours cannot be erased. Like this. Share it, subscribe. This is only the beginning. My revenge has just begun. Morning after I wrote those words, the air itself felt different. The Holloway house no longer felt like home. It felt like enemy territory. At the breakfast table, Daniel lounged with his arm around Rose, smiling as if he hadn't gutted me with his words the night before. Clara sat across from him, stirring her tea as if the world could be calmed with a spoon. I sat at the far end, the diary tucked beneath my shawl, my new weapon, heavy and honest. They thought they had buried me. They had only awakened me. Days blurred into weeks and Daniel tightened his grip on everything: money, decisions, even the servants who once respected me. One evening I overheard him tell Rose, "Your mother doesn't belong here anymore. People are already talking. Do you really want to be dragged down by her?" Rose nodded like a child trained to obey. Watching them was like watching a puppet show whose strings were spun from lies. One Sunday after church he staged his performance. Standing among our neighbors, he spoke loud enough to be kind. "Evelyn has been confused lately. Age does that, you know. We all have to be patient with her." Laughter rippled. Eyes turned toward me, filled with pity and dismissal. I wanted to shout, "I am not confused, I see clearer than any of you," but the words died behind my teeth. This wasn't about gossip. It was much larger. At night I slipped out. While they slept, I carried the diary to the old magnolia Thomas planted and wrote by candlelight. I recorded every insult, every deliberate slight, but I didn't stop at memory. I began to plan. Who still stood with me? Which neighbors might believe a careful truth? What if Daniel's business dealings could be exposed? My pen moved like a scalpel, precise, patient, surgical. I was no longer a woman cataloguing pain. I was a soldier preparing for war. The diary that once held whispers now held maps, names, dates, small things that would not bend to their stories. Paper and ink would be my proof. Quiet would become my strategy. The silence they expected to crush me would sharpen into something else entirely. If you've ever spoken truth and been laughed at, if you've been called confused when you are not, type your city and country in the comments. Let the world see we are not as few as they think. Share this story. Like it, subscribe. Silence is their shield. Our voices are the Fereth magnolia tree became my war room. By candlelight I learned the hardest truth. Revenge cannot be only anger. Anger is a spark, it burns bright, then dies. If I wanted Daniel to fall, I needed patience, evidence, and the kind of strategy he never imagined a 74-year-old could wield. So I began to watch, quietly, from the parlor window. I tracked their mornings, tea cooling untouched in my hands. Bank visits, real estate meetings, charity committees, all stages where Daniel played the man of integrity. I turned it into a map. Names, times, faces, plates, every small thread scribbled into my diary. Then came my first small victory. A box left carelessly at the back door. Inside ledgers, invoices, bank statements marked with the same crooked loops and ticks I had recorded for months. That night I copied every page at the library, the machine humming like a heartbeat. The diary and those photocopies became two blades of the same knife. I knew I couldn't fight alone. Samuel, the church caretaker, carried more truth than half the council. Mrs. Alvarez, the seamstress, whispered what she heard in municipal offices. And an old accountant, once Thomas's colleague, confirmed every forged signature. They believed me not because I begged, but because paper spoke in ways mouths could not. Pulling one thread unraveled the fabric. A shell company, a middleman, a charity fund hiding stolen money. Even a councilman's initials on an envelope. Every discovery was a spark in the dark. I wrote them down again and again, like prayers that doubled as warnings. Then came the first trap. Marco, a contractor, filmed the back study under the guise of repairs. The footage showed ledgers, envelopes, Daniel's notes in the margins. Not glamorous, but undeniable. For the first time, my truth existed outside my diary. It had eyes. The danger sharpened. One night Samuel pressed his phone into my hand, voice trembling. On the recording, Daniel's tone was calm, poisonous. Make sure the old woman disappears from our story. My skin prickled. This was no longer suspicion. It was threat. So we decided, no confrontation, no grand outburst he could twist. Instead, a leak. An anonymous packet to a hungry reporter, photocopies, a note asked about the charity and one line from my diary. They said I was confused. They were wrong. Within 48 hours the phone rang. Questions without pretense. Editors demanding more. The story began to flow, not a flood, not yet, but a steady stream carving through stone. If you've ever had to gather proof just to make someone believe you, if you've ever hunted truth like prey, write your city and country in the comments. Because we are not alone. And if you believe silence can become the loudest force, share this story, like it, subscribe. The quiet is no prison. The Quiet is Fereth's first story appeared quietly tucked between a police blotter and a charity fundraiser. Questions surround Holloway Charity. It didn't name Daniel. Not yet, but it was enough to make people lean in and whisper. At the grocery store I felt it change eyes on me. Not pity but curiosity. A low murmur, "Did you hear? Something's off with that fund." For the first time in years the shadows weren't only around me. They began to circle him. That night Daniel stormed through the house, tie loose, fist slamming the dining table. "Who's feeding them lies?" He roared, eyes snapping from Rose to Clara to the chair where I sat, steady as a stone. I sipped my tea. My heart temped like a drum, but my hand didn't shake. Rose whispered, "It's just gossip, Daniel. It will blow over." He wasn't convinced. He paced me like a predator testing the fence. "You've been quiet lately, Evelyn," he said. "Too quiet. Makes me wonder what you're really doing in that room of yours." The next morning, Clara knocked on my door, face drained of color. "Mother," she said, voice barely a breath, "I know you're behind the articles." My blood froze. Then she rushed on, "I don't blame you. Just be careful. Daniel has friends in places you can't imagine. He won't stop at humiliation. He'll ruin you." Her fear cut deeper than any accusation. Her warning didn't stop me. It sharpened me. If Daniel had allies, so would I. I staged something small and deliberate. I invited Mrs. Alvarez and Samuel in under the pretense of a Bible study. Daniel never showed for things that didn't aggrandize him. When the candles guttered low, I pulled out the diary, the photocopies, the recordings. Their faces went white, not from surprise but from confirmation. Suspicion became certainty. Samuel's fists clenched. "If this comes out, Evelyn, he'll fall harder than you can imagine." Mrs. Alvarez's voice was steady. "Then we make sure it comes out the right way." We had moved from whispers to plans. I'd already started pulling threads, a careless delivery, a tucked-away ledger, a shell company hiding like a termite colony in the walls. One revelation led to another: envelopes, late-night meetings, the councilman's initials on a single, damning page. Every small fact was a match. Together they formed a trail. We set a careful trap. A contractor filmed a repair in Thomas's old study and caught ledgers and envelopes on camera. Not glamorous footage, but clear. Ledger pages, an envelope with initials, Daniel's notes in the margins. When we played it for the accountant and Mrs. Alvarez, the color drained from their faces. This was no widow's rant. This was evidence with movement dates, hands, margins, the slow, ordinary way crimes hide. Danger stepped up its tempo. One night Samuel handed me his phone, trembling. He'd recorded a call, Daniel, calm and poisonous, telling a middleman to take care of a problem, make sure the old woman is quiet. The words landed like a blow. This wasn't rumor anymore. This was threat. We made a decision. A public showdown would play to his strength: stages, speeches, showmanship. So we did the opposite. We leaked, slow and surgical, to people who could not be brushed off: a local reporter hungry for truth, an ethical lawyer with a spine, an editor who smelled the story. I sent an anonymous packet, photocopies, a note ask about the charity, and a single line from my diary. They said I was confused. They were wrong. Within 48 hours the phone rang. Questions at first tentative, then urgent. Editors asked for more. The trickle became a current. The city that had once looked away now had a scratch on its conscience. When the first article ran, it was a pinprick in a paper, but pins do bleed. At the market, people no longer averted their eyes from me. Because of pity, they turned their curiosity toward him. Daniel's smugness started to feel brittle. He stomped around the house asking who was feeding them lies. But my house once was quieter now for a different reason. Everyone could feel the ripple. Clara's admission of fear became the pivot. Samuel, Mrs. Alvarez, the accountant, they were not celebrities. They were people who saw paper and could read truth. They became my allies behind the curtain, moving with the steady patience of those who've learned how power really works. If you've ever watched the powerful tremble when truth corners them, if you've ever had to gather proof, quietly and alone, to make someone believe you, type your city and country in the comments. I want to know where the brave hearts are listening from. And don't just watch, share this story, like it, subscribe. The storm is only beginning, and when truth starts to move, it makes a sound you can't ignore. By the time the second article hit the paper, Daniel could no longer dismiss it as gossip. The headline screamed, charity or cover-up. Holloway fund under investigation. This time, his name was in bold. The cracks began to show. At church, neighbors avoided our eyes as if guilt could be contagious. At the market, whispers floated like smoke, but they weren't about me any more they were about him. A woman clutched her child's hand tighter when Daniel walked past. As though he were a disease that could leap from his skin into hers, the respect he had spent his polishing, shining like armor, began to flake away like old paint, and me. I moved quietly through it, all a ghost, my pen sharper than his threats, my silence louder than his speeches. That night, Daniel's fury erupted. He smashed a glass against the wall, shards scattering like the mask he had worn for so long. "You think you can smear me?" He roared at Rose, his voice trembling with paranoia. "You think they can touch me?" Rose reached for him, tried to calm him, but he shoved her hand aside. His rage had found a target. "It's her," he spat, venom lacing his words. "Your mother. She's behind this. She's poisoning everyone." His words slashed through the room, sharp as knives. But I didn't flinch. Because the truth, my truth, was sharper than any rage he could muster. The real twist did not come from Daniel. It came from his closest ally, the councilman, whose name had appeared proudly on the charity papers, was suddenly exposed. A reporter uncovered his secret land deals, and desperation turned him into a coward. He cut ties with Daniel in the coldest way possible publicly. I had no knowledge of Mr. Holloway's arrangements, the councilman announced to the press. If his charity is implicated, it must be investigated fully. Betrayal disguised as self-preservation. For Daniel, it was a knife in the back. For me, it was a gift wrapped in gold. But the most fragile piece was not Daniel, nor the councilman. It was Rose. My daughter Daniel's greatest shield began to crumble under the weight of whispers that followed her like shadows. One night, I found her sitting alone in the parlor. A glass of wine trembled in her hand. Tears streaked her cheeks like rivers cutting through stone. "Mother," she whispered, her voice small, broken. "Is it true, everything they're saying?" I looked at her, my heart torn between fury and sorrow. "The truth has always been in front of you, Rose. You chose not to see it." Her silence told me more than her words ever could. She had begun to doubt the man she once defended with fire. And doubt is the first crack in any fortress. Have you ever seen the mighty begin to crumble? Have you ever watched the walls of a fortress collapse from the inside? If you've felt that moment when lies fall apart and the truth claws its way to the surface, you know the taste of my revenge. Because my fight is no longer mine alone. It belongs to every silenced voice, every betrayed heart, every soul forced into the shadows. And let me tell you this, no fortress, no matter how high, survives the fire of truth. It was a Saturday morning at the city market when Daniel's mask finally slipped. He walked with Rose at his side, chin high, smile pinned in place, but the crowd had changed. Whispers moved through stalls like a cold wind. "That's him. The one in the papers. Holloway fraud." A vendor, louder than he intended, called out, "Charity thief." The words landed and wouldn't let go. Daniel froze. For a beat his smile wavered, then he spun like a cornered animal and shouted, "Lies. All of it lies. Do you fools think I'd waste my life on petty schemes? I am a Holloway." But the faces in front of him were blank, measured and distant. Respect had drained from their eyes, the armor he'd worn for years shattered into something brittle and useless. I stood by the magnolia stall and watched him unravel, each shout peeling back another layer of the man who once commanded a room. Rose tugged at his sleeve, her voice shaking. "Daniel, please stop." It was not a plea of loyalty but of shame. In that instant the crowd saw more than his fury, they saw the crack in his household. Rose's eyes flicked to me, a single, heavy look that said what words could not. She was beginning to see the truth I had carried like a stone for so long. The next week the councilman called a press conference. Cameras flashed as he held up documents, as if proof could be waved like a banner. I regret to inform the public, he said, voice flat and practiced, that Mr. Daniel Holloway misused the charity under my name. I have handed everything to investigators. I stand ready to cooperate fully. It felt like the kill shot. The man who had once toasted Daniel now removed his support with the cold choreography of self-preservation. Loyalty dissolved into statements and signed pages. For Daniel, the comfortable world he'd built was collapsing. For me, each betrayal was a stone placed on the scale of truth. That night he came to my room. There was no pretense, no charm, only raw, dangerous rage. He slammed the door so hard the candlelight shivered. His shadow swallowed the room. You think you've won? He hissed, each word a promise. This is your doing. Don't you dare think I won't drag you down with me. I closed my diary, the pen resting under my fingers like a small, steady weapon. I met him without flinching. You already tried, Daniel. And yet here I am. For the first time his eyes faltered. He saw something in me he had never been able to control, a calm that was not fear. There was no fury in that calm, only a slow, unshakable resolve. It unsettled him more than any shout or threat could. After he left, I opened the diary and wrote another vow. Not vengeance for spectacle, no. This was a vow to be seen as I had been, to force the world to recognize the woman they tried to erase. They will not only see him fall, I wrote. They will see who I was when they tried to make me disappear. My name will not be silence. My name will be storm. Evidence alone would not finish the story. The papers had been whispering. Now I needed thunder. I picked up the phone and called the reporter, the first one who had listened instead of turning away. I told him plainly, you've heard the rumors. You've seen the papers. Now you'll hear from me. When I speak, it won't be whispers. It will be thunder. There is a difference between surviving and stepping forward. Surviving keeps you alive. Stepping forward makes them pay attention. If you have ever stood in the dark, threatened and minimized, then somehow found the courage to step into the light, tell me where you are. Type your city and country in the comments, like, share, subscribe, because this is no longer just my answer to what was done to me. This is a storm for every voice that was forced to be. Quiet reporter met me in a quiet cafe by the river. He was younger than I expected, barely 30, sharp-eyed, carrying the nervous hunger of someone who lives for a story. He sat close, palms on the table, as if steadying himself against what he might hear. Mrs. Holloway, he began, lowering his voice. We've all heard whispers. Whispering doesn't hold up in court. Do you have anything real? I set the diary between us. Its leather was soft with age, the corners worn. Ink had bled where tears had fallen, proof that these were not polished statements, but the map of a life that had been broken and stitched again. Every page is real, I said. Every page is a wound. Now those wounds will be turned into weapons. He turned the pages slowly, eyes narrowing as if each line demanded a new reckoning. When he reached the entries that referenced the recordings, his jaw tightened. He looked up at me, shaken. This is bigger than I thought. I smiled, but not with kindness, like a storm that knows the thunder is coming. I told you, I said. This is not gossip. This is war. 2 days later, the first broadcast aired. My voice trembled only enough to show I had lived through the fear. It did not break. I was silenced, I said into the camera. I was mocked. I was dismissed. But I was not defeated. They rolled the footage, paper trails, voice recordings, the small, damning details that make reputation rust. The Holloway name, once burnished gold by clever smiles and well-placed donations, now smelled of rot. Daniel's reaction was immediate and theatrical. He called a press conference, a brittle smile pasted on, voice booming with practiced outrage. These are fabrications, he declared. The ramblings of an old widow desperate for attention. He tried to make me the spectacle, to turn sympathy his way. He bought headlines. He hired lawyers who spoke in polished sentences that meant absolutely nothing to the people who remembered mortgages and missed dinners and the hush that follows a slammed door. He called priests to pulpits, convinced men in collars to say what he wanted the congregation to believe, that I was delusional, a woman lost in her memory. Neighbors who once muttered his praise behind cupped hands began to knock on my door with caution in their eyes. "Be careful," they said, lowering their voices. "He won't stop until you're destroyed." Yet there was a strange law in human hearts. The louder a man screams, the more he betrays himself. Daniel's fury carved the outline of his guilt for everyone to see. Each public outcry, each hired statement, became the very evidence he hoped to bury. His rage did the work of the truth in ways no paper could. So I kept speaking. Not to soothe or to plead, but to force the light into places he had tried to hide. When a world has trained itself to hush, a single clear voice rings like a bell. I was that bell. I chose to ring loud enough that even those who had looked away could no longer pretend they hadn't heard. If you have ever had your truth labeled a lie, if you have ever been called delusional when you knew the facts, add your city and country in the comments. Share this. Tell your neighbors. Because this is not just my story anymore, this is a torch. I will hand it to anyone who has been pushed into silence so they can carry it forward and make sure the guilty understand what it means when the light comes for them after my interview aired. The town split like a seam pulled to tight. Some people crossed the street to avoid being seen next to me, as if a single brush with scandal might stain them forever. Other strangers, neighbors, faces I'd never noticed stopped me on sidewalks and in front of bakeries to press a hand to mine and whisper thanks. "Thank you for speaking," a young woman mouthed, nerves trembling in her voice as if the words themselves were dangerous. Her eyes were rimmed with red. My uncle hurt me too. Nobody believed me. Maybe now they'll listen. Her small confession lit something that had been smoldering inside me for years. Suddenly my fight was larger than one man. It wasn't just about Daniel. It was about every hush, every dismissive laugh, every closed door that buried a woman's truth. The moment my pain became a mirror for someone else's, the shape of my revenge changed, it broadened. It gathered others like rain gathers into a storm. Daniel answered with poison. He plastered billboards with his face and slogans that screamed innocence, a good man destroyed by lies. He bought airtime on local radio and turned interviews into performances in earnest. Wounded husband talking about elderly confusion and a desperate widow seeking attention, he braided Rose in front of cameras, forcing her to cling to his arm while she said the lines he fed her. "My husband is innocent. My mother, she's not well." Each rehearsed phrase landed like a blade meant to cut me down. But the camera betrayed them. In the frame, her hands trembled. Her smile was brittle. The audience could see what their words tried desperately to hide, fear and coercion lurking under a thin skin of composure. One night, Clara slipped into my room like a shadow drawn toward light. Her face was pale, and the urgency in her voice made the air itself lean forward. "Mother," she said, avoiding my eyes, "I can't keep quiet anymore. I've seen too much." Daniel forged father's will. The papers he made Rose sign, he used them to take everything. The house, the bank accounts, all of it. I felt the weight of that betrayal land in my chest like iron. Thomas's last wish twisted into a leash Daniel wore around his own neck. It was the kind of betrayal that isn't loud. It's surgical. Clara didn't come empty-handed. She had stolen a photocopy from Daniel's drawer, the forged will, his handwriting, the faint, unmistakable loop of his initials. It read like mockery, so brazen it seemed to sneer at him. Seeing those lines, the audacity of it all, made my hands steady where they had once trembled. I decided to stop waiting for others to act. I gathered the forged will, Daniel's bank statements, the recorded threats he'd thought only his closed doors would hear. I sent copies direct, undeniable to the courthouse, to the district attorney's office, to the church board. No intermediaries, no chance for him to intercept or spin. I wanted the facts where the facts had to be judged. When the leak landed, it was not a whisper. It exploded into headlines: forgery, fraud, threats, Holloway empire on the brink. The empire didn't simply crack. It trembled, shuddered, and then staggered. People who had once taken his calls now avoided his gaze. Those who benefited quietly from the arrangement shifted their loyalties like leaves in a wind. The man who had smiled through gala dinners and ribbon cuttings now watched as hallways that used to open for him closed. There was no sudden, cinematic collapse, no dramatic overnight ruin. Instead, it was 1,000 small acts: a clerk who refused to sign, a neighbor who returned a favor with a cold shoulder, a donor who asked questions they had previously pretended not to hear. The rot spread not because I shouted it from rooftops, but because I put the proof where it could not be denied. If you have ever held evidence in trembling hands, if you have ever carried proof like a weapon only to be told to keep quiet, type your city and country in the comments. Share this story. Like it, subscribe, because proof is power, and power is the thing they fear most. Hand it to someone, and you give them the courage to stop being silent. It came on a Monday morning. An envelope slid under the Holloway door. Daniel tore it open with the certainty of a man who expected the world to obey him. The certainty left his face as he read, "You are hereby summoned to appear before the court." Forgery, fraud, threats, the words sat on the page like verdicts already written. I stood in the hallway, hands folded over my shawl, watching him as if I were watching a small, desperate animal. "Looks like the world finally wants to hear the truth," I said quietly. His eyes flared. "This isn't over, Evelyn. I'll bury you before I let them bury me," he promised, trying to sound like a threat and a vow all at once. Even as the words left his mouth, his hands trembled. On the day of the hearing, the courthouse steps filled like a tide. Some people carried signs justice for the widow while others clustered in tight knots, mouthing support for Daniel as if the old ties could still hold. But the loudest sound came from the cameras. Flashes cut the air as if trying to set the moment on fire. I walked up those steps with my diary in my hand, flanked by Mrs. Alvarez and Samuel. For years I had walked through life tucked into corners of shame. Now I walked in stormlight, the world focused on me, and the truth I had carried for too long. The courtroom settled like a held breath as Rose took the stand. Daniel's lawyers had placed her there, sure she would fit the script they'd written for her. She looked at me once, one look that contained a lifetime, and then folded her hands and began. "My husband," she started, voice thin with strain, "told me the will was father's last wish." But her words broke like glass. I saw him write parts of it. I knew, and I said nothing. Gasps rippled through the room. I watched Daniel's face go hard as stone, the color draining from it as if a light had been switched off. In that moment, Rose did not save me. She did something harder. She stopped saving him. Then Clara spoke. Unlike her sister, her voice did not shake. It was steady and clean as a bell. "Daniel threatened me, too," she told the judge, eyes fixed forward. "He told me if I revealed what I knew, he would ruin me. But I can't carry this any longer. He forged the will. He drained the accounts. He even told people to take care of the old woman." Each sentence she uttered landed like a hammer blow against the mask he had worn for years. Testimony by testimony, the myths that protected him began to disintegrate. For years my daughters had been mute witnesses, trapped in the gravity of his lies. Now, one by one, they became my witnesses in court, threads pulling free until the whole weave came undone. The prosecution laid the papers down like a map of the crime, signatures that didn't match, bank transfers that tracked to hidden accounts, voicemail threats that sounded too much like the man who had once held power in this town. There were moments when the ordinary people in the gallery met each other's eyes and understood, without words, that the world they had trusted had been manipulated in plain sight. Daniel did not crumble in a single dramatic moment. There was no sudden collapse of a throne. Instead, the unraveling happened in the small certainties: a donor who withdrew support, a parishioner who refused to meet his gaze, a legal aid who asked the hard questions his team had avoided. The rot spread in daylight now, and daylight is the patient enemy of secrecy. When the judge called for recess, the courthouse hummed with a different electricity. People who had once crossed streets to avoid me now nodded as I passed. Those nods were not pity, they were recognition. We had all watched the quiet work of truth turn whispers into evidence. If you have ever watched betrayal turn into redemption, if you have ever felt silence break open and truth step out, write your city and country in the comments. And if this story stirs something in you, share it. Like it, subscribe, because this isn't just my fight anymore. It's the proof that silence can be broken. That truth, when carried and spoken, has the power to unmake the unjust and return dignity to those who were forced to hide. Be the second week of hearings. Daniel no longer strode into court with the arrogance that once wrapped him like a cloak. His suits remained sharp, his tie perfectly knotted, but his eyes, those betrayed him. They flickered, restless, unable to hide the truth. The same cameras that had once worshipped him now caught the sweat glistening at his temples, the tick that pulled at his jaw. Headlines no longer praised, they prophesied. Holloway empire on the verge of collapse. I sat in the front row, my diary steady in my lap. Every time his gaze darted toward me, I met it with a smile. Not kind, not forgiving, but the quiet, patient smile of a storm that had been gathering for decades. Daniel's lawyer strutted across the courtroom like an actor rehearsing for a role he thought he owned. With every flourish he mocked me, senile, delusional, a lonely widow desperate for relevance. He held my diary high and waved it like a prop. This, he sneered. These are nothing but the scribbles of an old woman drowning in fantasies. His supporters chuckled, emboldened by his theatre dot, but then the judge leaned forward, voice sharp as a gavel. And what of the bank statements? The recordings? The lawyer froze. His practiced rhythm broke. He stammered, his words cracking like thin glass under too much weight. Even the strongest performance cannot hide cracks in the script. On the third day, Rose appeared not as Daniel's loyal wife, but as something hollowed out. No jewelry adorned her, no bright dress. Only grey fabric and the bruised shadows of sleepless nights beneath her eyes. The prosecutor's question hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Holloway, did you know your husband forged the will? The silence stretched, suffocating. Finally, her lips parted. Yes, gasps rippled through the room. Daniel's head snapped toward her, his face hardened into a mask of betrayal. But Rose did not meet his eyes. For the first time, her gaze stayed on me. That night, Clara returned to me once more, her face pale, but her hand steady. Mother. I found something. She held out a small bundle of letters, yellowed and creased, hidden beneath the false bottom of a drawer. They were Thomas's, my Thomas. His last words etched into fragile paper. Daniel's circles rose like a vulture. One letter read, I don't trust him with our future. Evelyn must protect what we built. I clutched the letters, tears burning my eyes. My husband had seen the storm on the horizon. He had tried to warn us. Now his words rising from the grave would finish what I had begun. If you've ever held the words of someone you loved, long after they were gone, words that gave you strength when you needed it most, right? Your city and country in the comments. Share this story, like, subscribe, because sometimes the dead speak louder than the living. Be the fourth week of hearings. Daniel was no longer the man who once strutted through town. His eyes had sunk, his voice cracked when he spoke, and the proud tilt of his shoulders sagged under the weight of truth. But desperation makes a man dangerous. That night, long after the courthouse emptied, I heard a knock at my door. Slow, heavy, Evelyn, his voice slithered through the wood, thin and venomous. "We don't have to keep fighting. Hand me those letters, the diary, and I'll make sure you live comfortably. No court, no scandal. Just peace." I sat by the candlelight, steady as stone, peace. From the man who had forged my husband's will, stolen my home, turned my daughters against me. My silence was my answer. And silence was louder than any scream. His voice sharpened, cracking with rage. "Don't test me, old woman. I've buried worse than you." The knob rattled violently, twisting beneath his hand. My heart pounded, but I did not move. If he broke in, he would not find fear, he would find fire. At last, his footsteps retreated down the hall. But his words remained, etched into the silence like knives left behind in the dark. The next morning, I did not walk into court as prey. I walked as witness to my own war. In my hands were Thomas's letters, bound with ribbon, and my diary pressed close to my chest. When the judge asked if I had further evidence, I rose. My voice was clear, steady. Yes, letters from my late husband. His own words warning us of Daniel Holloway. The clerk read them aloud. Thomas's handwriting trembled across the page, filled with fears he had carried to his grave. Daniel's circles rose like a vulture. "I don't trust him with our future. Evelyn must protect what we build." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously. The dead had spoken, and the living could no longer deny it. Daniel lurched to his feet, shouting, "Lies. Forged, all of it forged." But the judge's gavel cracked through the chaos. "Enough, Mr. Holloway. Sit down, or I will hold you in contempt." And suddenly, the courtroom wasn't looking at me anymore. They were looking at him, sweat dripping, fury spilling, the polished mask falling to shards. For the first time, the world didn't see a respected man. They saw the predator he truly was. If you've ever seen a mask shatter before your eyes, if you've ever watched the powerful reduced to nothing, write your city and country in the comments. Like, share, subscribe, because my storm is not only mine. It belongs to you. 2 nights after Thomas's letters were read aloud in court, a sleek black car idled outside the church. Its windows were dark as caves, the engine a low, waiting hum. A man stepped out, Daniel's lawyer smile polished, hands fidgeting with the edge of his briefcase like a man who wanted confidence to mask fear. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, voice low and careful, "Mr. Holloway is willing to settle. A large sum enough for you to live comfortably for the rest of your days. All we ask is that you withdraw the letters and the diary from evidence. Money," the same language he had always thought could buy silence. I leaned on my cane and looked him straight in the eye. Candlelight made a hard line across his face. "Tell Daniel," I said, my voice as steady as stone, "I do not sell graves. Not my husband's, not my own." His smile cracked the way cheap porcelain does. He slid back into the car and it melted into the night. The bribe failed. The threats returned. 3 nights later, while I slept in Clara's guest room, a sudden crash sliced through the dark. Glass shattered. A brick skidded across the floor, wrapped in paper and left like a message. On the paper, the handwriting was jagged and furious. "Stop, or you won't live to see the verdict." Clara burst into the room, white-faced. "Mother, are you hurt?" She gasped. I picked up the brick with hands that trembled but did not falter, then set it carefully on the table as if placing a relic. "No, child," I said. "This is not a threat. This is a confession. Desperation speaks louder than denial." That brick admitted everything his lawyers still tried to hide. The next hearing erupted. Daniel's attorney scrambled to call the act a prank, to laugh it off as mischief. But the judge's patience had thinned to a razor edge. Then we played the recordings Samuel had captured weeks earlier. Daniel's voice laid bare, venomous and precise. That old woman doesn't know who she's dealing with. I'll bury her story with her body if I have to, the courtroom convulsed. Reporters leaned forward, pens and cameras catching the tremor of exposed evil. Daniel's mask didn't merely crack that day. It pulverized into dust. Something in Rose broke with it. She stood not called, not prodded, and rose of her own accord. Judge, her voice shook but carried, I was blind. I defended a man who poisoned my family. I cannot undo the years I betrayed my mother, but I can speak now. Her tears fell, honest and hot, and her words cut clean. Daniel Holloway is guilty. I will testify to everything I saw. The silence that followed her confession was like thunder rolling up from a valley. Even Daniel's lawyer sat frozen, the threads of his rehearsed narrative slipping through his fingers. When the gavel fell that day, it did more than keep order. It marked the end of a stage where money and influence still bought certainties. The world was watching, and the world now saw the truth. A man who had depended on other people's quiet was left, alone with nothing but the sound of his own undoing. If you have ever watched silence break into truth, if you have ever seen a chain of secrets pulled apart, share where you are. Type your city and country in the comments. Like, share, subscribe. This storm is not only mine. It is for every mother who was told to be quiet, and every voice that was forced into the dark morning the verdict was read felt like the eye of a hurricane. People lined the courthouse steps with pale faces and lifted phones. News vans droned like steel beehives along the curb. Even the pigeons seemed to hold their breath. Inside, the courtroom felt smaller than it had all week. The judge adjusted his glasses, papers whispered against wood, and my diary lay closed on the counsel table like a sleeping animal. I had slept little. Sleep had been a luxury I lost a long time ago. My heart kept time like a drum. When the foreman stood, his voice carried the weight of a generation. On the charges of forgery, fraud, and threats on all counts, the jury finds the defendant guilty. The words hit like cannon fire. Daniel's face went white, then grey. He sagged as though the air had abandoned him. A thin, sharp sound rose from the gallery gasps, someone choking back a sob. Rose wept openly. Clara's hand tightened around mine until our knuckles matched in colour. For a moment, I felt nothing. Then everything rushed in at once: relief, sorrow, vindication, and a quiet peace so unfamiliar it almost frightened me. The peace of the truth finally being recognized. Edsenting was not generous. Years were read like stones dropped into deep water. Years for fraud, years for forgery, an added term for the threats. The judge's voice never wavered. The gavel came down with the finality of a door closing. As they led Daniel away, reporters shouted questions, cameras burst into light, neighbors craned their necks for one last look at the man they had once praised for his charm and checks and speeches. His last glance toward me held no defiance. It was smaller than that shame wrapped in the new knowledge that even power has an ending. By afternoon, the financial world answered the verdict with its own verdicts. Accounts frozen. Properties placed under receivership. Donations to the charity suspended pending audits. The guilt peeled fast. Men who used to smile at his table found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. Those who had traded favors through back doors suddenly preferred the front steps and the bright light. But the legal decision was only the first collapse. The social unmaking followed with equal force. Neighbors who once nodded politely now turned away. Business associates withdrew their statements of support. The charity board delivered a public apology for oversight that had been more convenience than ignorance. The church that had rung with hymns in my husband's honor released a statement of failure and promised full cooperation with investigators. Donors asked for their names to be removed from plaques and photo walls. Portraits came down from the donor gallery, leaving rectangles of cleaner paint, small ghosts of what had been admired. People asked me later if I felt triumphant. The honest answer is more complicated than triumph. Relief, yes, strong enough to tighten my ribs. Vindication, certainly. I no longer woke to the phantom brush of a hand that did not belong to me. I could sit in the parlor without flinching when footsteps approached. But alongside the relief grew a slow, stubborn ache for what would never return, my husband's quiet presence. The comfortable lie of a family that once looked whole from far enough away. Magnolia blossoms that had always opened in spring without asking for permission or applause. Revenge does not return what was broken. It reorders the world. It forces recognition. It compels accountability. It gives names back to those who were made nameless. I learned that the hard way, page by page, night by night, in a house that had asked me to be quiet and small. One quiet Sunday after the verdict, I walked to Thomas's bench beneath the old magnolia. I took the bundle of his letters from my handbag and read them again, letting his voice fold into mine and reach across the years. He had seen the storm coming and left me a compass made of words. He asked me to protect what we built. He warned me to watch the man who had learned to smile with other people's mouths. In my tears there was gratitude that he saw, that he cared enough to write, that his love had not been wasted on the pretense of peace. Later, at a small memorial my daughters arranged, we read excerpts from those letters. People listened differently now, some wept. Some stared at the floor as if the truth might be spelled there in the grain. A community that had once turned a way out of fear leaned in to bear witness. The same mouths that whispered rumors learned new words. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I should have asked. Months passed. The machinery of the courts kept grinding. Daniel served his time. His name wore shame like a stain that no laundering could lift. The charity restructured beneath new leadership. Recovered funds were redirected to real causes with an independent oversight committee, not perfect, but necessary. Small changes mattered. The bathrooms were renovated at the shelter. Gas cards were issued to families that had been choosing between a commute and dinner. Spreadsheets started adding up to groceries and medicine, not galas and champagne. Clara moved in with me for a while. She apologized in small, honest ways, a hand on my shoulder when the kettle whistled, a folded blanket left at the foot of my bed, the kind of quiet that let someone else breathe more easily. Rose moved away for a time to a place where the echoes were softer. We did not stitch everything back together. Some seams hold better when they are left visible. We learned to live around the space of what had been broken. To set the table with a new understanding of who sits where and why. The diary stayed with me, its leather worn thin by thumbs and tears. Its spine cracked in the places where I had returned again and again to remember who I was when the house insisted that I be something else. In those pages I kept more than harms. I wrote down the courage I saw, a neighbor who finally spoke, a seamstress who refused to look away. A young reporter who risked his career for the truth. A church secretary who kept copies when she was told to shred. If my revenge did anything good, it did this. It nudged a town into reckoning. It turned a son-in-law into a footnote and my daughters into women who now know the difference between a myth and a mother. Years later, grandchildren danced beneath the magnolia. The house never returned to its old self. Why should it? The world had been altered by what happened, and some things deserved to stay changed. People greeted me with a softer respect, not the false adoration Daniel once enjoyed, but a genuine recognition, often accompanied by quiet apologies from those who had doubted. I forgave in ways that did not mean forgetting. I forgave to free the living from the dead weight of shame. On mild evenings I sat on the porch with the diary closed beside my teacup and watched magnolia petals fall like small, certain promises. I never expected to become a symbol. Yet if one stubborn widow's voice could uproot a corruption, that had grown like kudzu over this town, if it could remind people that a voice matters, even when it shakes, then perhaps justice has found a new shape here. If my story stirs something in you, anger, courage, or the refusal to be quiet, tell me where you are. Type your name, your city, your country in the comments. Share this with someone who needs the bravery to speak. Like and subscribe if you must call it that, but understand what it means, not applause, not spectacle, but witnesses. Silence protected the powerful for too long. If one widow's refusal could ripple into change, imagine what 1,000 voices might do. My name is Evelyn Grace Holloway. I lived, I lost, and I made sure the truth could not be buried again.